The most expensive lies are the ones printed on official letterhead. I realized that the moment I tore open a certified envelope on the porch of my riverside cabin and watched an $18,000 bill slide into my hands like it belonged there. The smell of damp cedar drifted through the cool morning air while the river behind me rolled lazily over smooth stones, completely unaware that someone, somewhere, had decided to charge me for land they didn't even own. At first, I honestly thought it had to be a clerical mistake. The envelope carried the polished logo of the Willow Creek Ridge Homeowners Association, complete with gold embossing and enough legal language to intimidate almost anyone. The bold heading read, "Special assessment due immediately." Below that was my name, Ethan Carter, followed by a parcel description I recognized instantly. My riverfront acreage. The total due was exactly $18,000, with late fees beginning in 15 days if I failed to comply. I read the first page twice, then a third time. According to the letter, my property had allegedly benefited from community improvements, shoreline maintenance, security patrols, and recreational upgrades authorized by the HOA board. There was only one problem. My cabin wasn't inside their neighborhood. It never had been. I set the papers on the old wooden picnic table my father and I had rebuilt years before. The rough grain pressed against my fingertips as I unfolded the county survey I'd received during closing only 6 weeks earlier. I could still smell fresh printer ink mixed with pine sap from the stacked firewood nearby. The thick blue line marking the subdivision boundary stopped nearly a quarter-mile short of my land. Between the HOA and my cabin sat protected riverbank, public easement trails, and several privately owned parcels that had existed long before anyone dreamed of building a gated community. Somehow, despite every map saying otherwise, someone had decided my quiet little cabin belonged under their authority. My phone buzzed before I even finished comparing the documents. An email notification arrived from the same HOA office, politely reminding me that failure to submit payment could result in liens, legal proceedings, and additional enforcement costs. The confidence behind those words caught my attention more than the threat itself. Whoever sent that message wasn't guessing. They genuinely believed they had jurisdiction over property outside their own boundary lines. That wasn't just aggressive. It was deliberate. I walked down toward the river where the water reflected the first orange light of sunrise. The gentle current carried fallen leaves beneath the old wooden dock that came with the property. The previous owner had told me his grandfather built that dock nearly 70 years ago, back when this stretch of river had nothing but fishing cabins, cottonwoods, and gravel roads. Every board creaked with history. Every inch of shoreline reminded me why I'd left the city behind. I didn't buy this place for investment. I bought it because silence had become more valuable than square footage. Then I noticed something that made the back of my neck tighten. Across the river trail, planted beside a fresh survey stake, stood a brand new metal sign with bright reflective lettering. Property subject to Willow Creek Ridge HOA regulations. It hadn't been there yesterday. Someone hadn't just mailed me a bill. Someone had already begun moving my property into their world, one official-looking document at a time. I bought the cabin exactly 42 days before that envelope arrived, and I still remember the first morning I unlocked the front door. The scent of aged pine drifted through every room, mixing with cool river air that slipped between the old window frames. The place was small, barely 1,100 square feet, with a stone fireplace that had probably warmed 3 generations of families before I ever stepped inside. Most people would have seen peeling paint, worn floorboards, and an outdated kitchen. I saw something entirely different. I saw peace. After 15 years designing bridges and public infrastructure across 3 states, I had grown tired of airports, conference rooms, and traffic that never seemed to end. Every project came with deadlines. Every phone call came with another problem to solve. I wanted one place where nobody needed anything from me. My father used to bring me fishing along this river when I was a kid. We would leave before sunrise with an old aluminum tackle box rattling in the truck bed and spend entire Saturdays listening to nothing except flowing water and birds hidden in the cottonwoods. He always said that rivers had a way of reminding people how small their worries really were. After he passed away 3 years earlier, I found myself driving back here more often, parking along the same gravel road, watching the current move exactly as it had decades before. When the cabin unexpectedly came onto the market, It felt less like a purchase and more like finding something that had been waiting for me all along. The seller, an elderly man named Harold Benson, walked me across every inch of the property before we signed the papers. He pointed out the old flood markers carved into an oak tree, the original dock supports driven into the riverbed by his grandfather, and the faded property monuments that had survived storms, floods, and changing county maps. He smiled when he said, "This land has always stood on its own." At the time, I thought he was simply proud of his family's history. Looking back, I realized he was telling me something far more important. During closing, the title company handed me a thick folder containing surveys, deeds, tax records, easement maps, and county approvals dating back decades. I skimmed through most of it, trusting the professionals had already done their job. The surveyor even traced the boundary lines with his pen, explaining that my acreage existed as an independent parcel outside every subdivision surrounding the river corridor. It seemed straightforward enough that I never questioned it again. My nearest neighbors waved whenever they passed by in pickup trucks. The local hardware store owner remembered Harold by name and thanked me for keeping the cabin instead of tearing it down for vacation rentals. Even the county tax office processed my paperwork without mentioning any homeowners association. Everything about the property suggested independence. That was exactly why I bought it. I spent my evenings replacing warped deck boards, repainting window trim, and repairing loose hinges while the steady rhythm of the river echoed behind me. The quiet became part of my routine. Coffee tasted better on the porch. Sleep came easier beneath the sound of moving water. It never crossed my mind that someone living nearly a quarter-mile away was quietly drawing new lines on paper, preparing to convince everyone that my cabin had somehow become part of a neighborhood it had never belonged to. The first time I met Victoria Hayes, she was standing beside a white luxury sport utility vehicle parked in front of the Willow Creek Ridge Clubhouse, wearing an immaculate cream-colored blazer that looked far too expensive for a Tuesday morning board meeting. Even before she introduced herself, I could smell the sharp perfume that seemed to linger in the warm air long after she walked away. She smiled the way experienced real estate agents often do, polished enough to appear friendly while revealing absolutely nothing about what they were really thinking. "You must be Ethan," she said, extending her hand as if we had already agreed on something. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I glanced toward the clubhouse behind her. It sat behind decorative stone walls nearly a quarter-mile from my property. "Actually," I replied, "I live outside the subdivision." Her smile never moved. "Everyone around here is part of the community eventually." At the time, I assumed she meant the local county, the nearby businesses, or simply the people living along the river. I laughed politely, shook her hand, and thought nothing more about the conversation. Over the following weeks, however, I began noticing little things that did not fit together. Every Saturday morning, Victoria drove through roads that technically belonged to the county instead of the subdivision, stopping whenever she spotted contractors, landscapers, or delivery trucks. She always carried a clipboard tucked beneath one arm, making notes while speaking confidently about neighborhood standards, future improvements, and preserving property values. People listened because she sounded certain. Confidence has a way of becoming authority when nobody stops to question it. One afternoon, I visited the small general store near the highway for paint supplies. The cashier, an older gentleman named Frank, recognized my address from the receipt. He lowered his voice and smiled carefully. "You bought Harold's cabin, did you?" I nodded. Frank leaned against the counter before adding, "Then do yourself a favor. Keep every piece of paperwork you have." Before I could ask what he meant, another customer walked in, and the conversation ended. His words stayed with me longer than I expected. A few evenings later, while replacing weathered boards on the dock, I noticed Victoria standing across the river trail with two men wearing bright safety vests. They pointed toward my shoreline several times while unfolding what looked like a large site map. Whenever I looked up, the conversation stopped. They rolled the map closed, climbed into a pickup truck, and drove away without crossing onto my property or introducing themselves. It was strange, but not illegal. I convinced myself they were probably discussing future trail maintenance or county drainage work. Then another certified envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one was not asking for money. It welcomed me as a property owner benefiting from Willow Creek Ridge amenities and invited me to attend the next Homeowners Association board meeting to discuss compliance responsibilities. I read the letter twice while listening to the gentle splash of water beneath the dock. Every sentence referred to my land as though the question had already been settled. There was no explanation, no survey, no legal citation, only assumptions presented as established fact. The realization settled over me as quietly as the evening fog drifting across the river. Victoria Hayes was not making a mistake. She was building a story, one official letter at a time, and somewhere inside that story, my cabin had become the final piece she intended to claim. The pressure started building so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was overreacting. 3 days after the second certified letter arrived, another envelope appeared in my mailbox before breakfast. This one listed 4 separate violations that somehow existed on property the association had never legally controlled. According to the notice, my dock failed community design standards, my exterior paint color had not been approved by the architectural committee, my gravel driveway required resurfacing to meet neighborhood specifications, and my firewood stack created an unacceptable visual obstruction. At the bottom of the page, each violation carried its own fine, accumulating daily until corrected. I stood on the porch listening to the soft rush of the river while the papers fluttered in the morning breeze. The entire situation would have been almost funny if the numbers were not growing so quickly. 2 days later, another package arrived, this time from an attorney representing the homeowners association. The language was polished, formal, and carefully written. It explained that failure to comply with association obligations could result in legal action, collection costs, liens, and any additional remedies allowed by law. What caught my attention was not the threat. It was the confidence. Whoever prepared that letter never questioned whether the association actually possessed authority over my land. They wrote as though ownership itself had already been decided. That afternoon, I drove toward town to pick up hardware supplies and noticed 2 contractors unloading freshly painted metal posts near the public trail leading toward my property. Bright orange survey flags stretched across the grass beside them. One worker looked up as I parked and politely handed me a folded work order. Across the top were the words River Access Beautification Project. The customer listed on the form was Willow Creek Ridge Homeowners Association. Before I could ask another question, the foreman simply shrugged and said they were following instructions provided by the client. By sunset, a decorative sign stood only a few yards from my property line, pointing visitors toward what it described as the Willow Creek Community River Recreation Area. People walking the trail naturally assumed the surrounding shoreline belonged to the subdivision because the sign made it appear official. The next Saturday, I walked outside carrying a cup of coffee and found 3 families standing near the edge of my dock reading the new marker. They apologized immediately after I explained the property was private, insisting they believed the homeowners association had recently opened public access. None of them acted disrespectfully. They had simply trusted the sign. That was when I finally understood the real strategy. Victoria was not trying to convince me. She was trying to convince everyone else first. If enough people accepted the new version of reality, challenging it would become increasingly difficult. The following Monday, I opened my email to discover an updated account statement. The balance had climbed beyond $19,000 after administrative charges, compliance inspections, processing fees, and interest were added over the weekend. Attached to the statement was a color map with my cabin outlined in bright yellow beside the words Proposed Community Expansion Area. Proposed. That single word refused to leave my mind. It was the first honest thing they had sent me. Everything else treated their authority as existing fact. This map quietly admitted something different. Their expansion had not happened yet. Someone was still trying to make it happen, and for reasons I could not yet understand, my quiet stretch of riverfront seemed to be the piece they wanted more than anything. I decided to stop guessing and start asking questions. Early the next morning, I drove to the county administration building carrying the same thick folder the title company had handed me at closing. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and fresh coffee drifting from a vending area near the entrance. People moved quietly from office to office carrying survey maps, permit applications, and property records that stretched back generations. I took a number, waited nearly 40 minutes, and finally sat across from a county clerk named Melissa. She listened patiently while I spread the homeowners association notices beside my survey. Her eyes moved back and forth between the documents before she frowned slightly. Your parcel number looks separate, she said carefully. But I cannot make a legal determination from this desk. She printed copies of the county tax map, highlighted my parcel, and suggested I speak with the recorder's office if ownership boundaries were ever questioned. It was helpful, but it was not the clear answer I had hoped for. The recorder's office was 2 floors upstairs. Another line. Another waiting room. Another polite employee who explained that recorded deeds could confirm ownership history, but interpretation of legal disputes belonged elsewhere. Everyone seemed willing to explain their own small piece of the system, yet nobody wanted to say the one sentence I needed to hear. Nobody simply declared that the homeowners association had no authority. By the time I walked back outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows so brightly I had to shield my eyes. My folder contained several new maps and copies, but no immediate solution. That evening, another certified envelope waited in my mailbox. This time, the association informed me that my account had entered formal enforcement status. The total balance had climbed again, now including legal review fees and compliance administration costs. Reading the notice while standing beside the quiet river felt strangely unreal. The current continued flowing exactly as it had yesterday. The birds still landed on the same weathered dock posts. Nature acknowledged none of the paperwork piling up inside my kitchen. I contacted a local real estate attorney the following morning. After reviewing the documents for nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. You may be right, he admitted, but proving someone is wrong can be expensive. He estimated that a full legal challenge could cost tens of thousands of dollars if the dispute continued through multiple hearings. His words echoed in my head during the drive home. Paying the association felt wrong. Fighting them looked even more expensive. Over the next several days, I spoke with neighbors along the river, hoping someone had seen something similar. Most offered sympathy before giving exactly the same advice. Just pay it and move on. They always get their way. It is easier than arguing with them. None of those answers sat well with me, but I understood why people said them. Constant pressure has a way of wearing down even reasonable people. Still, one detail refused to leave my mind. Every document the homeowners association mailed me proudly listed my property address, my name, and my tax parcel number. Yet not a single letter ever quoted the legal description from my recorded deed. Not once. For an organization that claimed complete authority over my land, they seemed strangely careful about avoiding the one document that actually defined where my property began and where it ended. Something about that silence felt louder than every threat they had sent so far. I spent the next 2 evenings turning my cabin into something that looked less like a home and more like a research office. The dining table disappeared beneath rolled surveys, county tax maps, faded deeds, and handwritten notes that stretched back nearly a century. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with old paper while the steady murmur of the river drifted through the open windows. Every document seemed to answer one question while creating 2 more. I stopped looking for evidence that the homeowners association was wrong. Instead, I started asking why they were avoiding the one piece of information that mattered most. The legal description. That decision changed everything. I drove back to the recorder's office with a very specific request. Rather than asking about my property, I requested the original recorded plat for Willow Creek Ridge along with every amendment filed since the subdivision had been created. The clerk disappeared into the archive room for nearly 20 minutes before returning with a thick stack of recorded plats and several oversized maps that had clearly been handled for decades. I carefully spread them across the public viewing table beneath bright fluorescent lights. The oldest subdivision map showed every residential lot, every common area, every utility easement, and every planned roadway. One detail immediately caught my eye. The western boundary stopped exactly where my survey said it should. It never crossed the protected river corridor. It never touched my parcel. Curious, I continued reading through the later amendments. Landscaping revisions. Additional parking. Clubhouse expansion. Stormwater improvements. Walking trails. Every amendment expanded facilities inside the subdivision, but none altered the legal boundary itself. Then I noticed something even more interesting. Several recent presentation drawings had been attached to planning discussions years earlier. They illustrated a future vision of extended river access, scenic overlooks, kayak launches, and recreational paths reaching toward the water. Across the top of every drawing appeared the same small word I had already seen on the Homeowners Association map. Proposed. None of those concepts had ever become recorded property lines. They were ideas, not ownership. I requested certified copies before leaving the courthouse. On my way home, I stopped at the County Geographic Information Systems office, where a technician pulled up aerial property data that layered parcel boundaries over satellite imagery. Watching the digital map load across the screen felt almost surreal. Bright colored boundary lines appeared one by one until my cabin stood completely isolated from Willow Creek Ridge. There was no overlap, no shared parcel, no hidden strip connecting the subdivision to my land. The technician zoomed in, rotated the display, and quietly said, "Your parcel has remained unchanged for decades." He was not offering legal advice. He was simply reading county records exactly as they existed. Back at the cabin, I compared every map side by side. That was when another detail finally clicked into place. Every homeowners association letter listed only my mailing address and tax parcel number, but never once quoted the meets and bounds description from the recorded deed, because doing so would immediately expose that my property existed entirely outside their jurisdiction. They were relying on assumptions instead of recorded boundaries. The realization settled over me as the evening sun reflected across the river. Victoria Hayes had not discovered new authority over my land. She was trying to create the appearance of authority first, hoping nobody would ever follow the paper trail all the way back to the county records where the truth had been sitting quietly for decades. I did not send an angry email. I did not march into the Homeowners Association office waving maps across a conference table. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I stopped responding altogether. Every new letter that arrived went into a neatly labeled binder beside my dining room table. Every email was downloaded, printed, and filed in chronological order. Every photograph of the newly installed signs, survey stakes, and so-called community improvements received a date, time, and location. The more I learned about property disputes, the more I realized that facts become far more convincing when they are allowed to develop naturally instead of being interrupted halfway through. Victoria clearly believed I would panic, write a check, or argue emotionally. I decided to give her none of those reactions. The river continued moving at its own steady pace outside my windows, while I quietly built something much stronger than an argument. I built a timeline. Each morning began with coffee on the porch, followed by another careful review of county records before heading into town. I ordered certified copies of every recorded deed affecting the surrounding properties, requested historical aerial photographs from the county archive, and hired an independent licensed surveyor to verify every monument marking my parcel boundaries. When he finished walking the property with professional-grade equipment, he smiled as he folded away his tripod. "Your corners are exactly where the county says they are," he told me. "Nothing about these lines is questionable." I thanked him and added another document to the growing binder. Meanwhile, the Homeowners Association seemed determined to help my case without realizing it. Their weekly emails became increasingly confident. One message announced future landscaping projects extending toward the river. Another welcomed residents to enjoy expanded recreational access. A newsletter even included a color rendering of families relaxing near a riverside overlook positioned almost exactly where my private dock already stood. Every publication described plans that assumed ownership without ever proving it. I printed every page. I also noticed something else. Victoria had begun referring to my property as part of Phase 2 community expansion instead of existing association land. The wording changed just enough to reveal the truth hiding underneath. Expansion meant they were trying to add something they did not already possess. I highlighted every appearance of that phrase in bright yellow. Late one afternoon, I received a formal notice inviting me to appear before the Homeowners Association Compliance Committee to discuss unresolved violations. Most people probably expected me to decline. Instead, I politely accepted in writing while carefully requesting copies of every recorded document establishing the association's jurisdiction over my parcel before the meeting. My request was simple, respectful, and impossible to misunderstand. Days passed without an answer. Another reminder arrived confirming the meeting date, but my document request remained completely ignored. That silence spoke louder than any threat they had mailed during the previous month. If recorded authority actually existed, Producing it would have taken only minutes. As the meeting approached, I organized my binder one final time. The first section contained every certified county map. The second held historical plats and recorded deeds. The third documented every letter, fine, invoice, newsletter, and email the homeowners association had sent since the day I bought the cabin. Looking across the stack of carefully arranged evidence, I realized something important. I was no longer trying to prove that Victoria Hayes had made a mistake. I was preparing to let her prove it herself, simply by asking her to produce the one document that never seemed to exist. The homeowners association meeting was held on a Thursday evening inside the clubhouse I had driven past dozens of times, but never entered. The room smelled of fresh coffee, polished wood, and new carpet, the kind of carefully maintained space designed to project authority before anyone even spoke. Board members sat behind a long table with neatly stacked folders, while residents filled folding chairs along the walls. Victoria Hayes greeted everyone with the same polished smile I remembered from the day we first met, speaking confidently about community improvements, shared responsibility, and protecting property values. When my name was called, she folded her hands together and looked directly at me. "Mr. Carter," she began, "this meeting provides you one final opportunity to resolve your outstanding compliance issues before additional legal action becomes necessary." I thanked her calmly, opened my binder, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was the written request I had previously sent asking for the recorded document establishing the association's legal jurisdiction over my parcel. "Before we discuss compliance," I said, "could you please provide the recorded declaration, amendment, or deed that includes my property within the homeowners association?" The room became unexpectedly quiet. Victoria glanced toward the association attorney seated beside her. He flipped through several folders before quietly asking for my parcel number. I gave it to him. More pages turned. More whispered conversation followed. Finally, Victoria smiled again, although this time it looked noticeably less certain. She explained that community planning documents anticipated future expansion and that my property benefited from nearby neighborhood improvements. I nodded and slid another document across the table. It was the certified subdivision plat recorded with the county. Bright yellow highlighting marked the western boundary ending well before my land. Next came the certified amendment history showing no recorded expansion. Then the geographic information system's parcel map. Then the independent survey confirming every boundary monument remained unchanged. Finally, I placed the historical planning illustration beside the recorded plat. One carried the word proposed across the top. The other carried the county recording stamp that made it legally binding. They looked similar enough to confuse someone unfamiliar with land records, but legally they represented completely different things. The association attorney studied both documents for nearly a full minute before removing his glasses and reading through the certified copies again. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody argued. Even the quiet hum of the ceiling ventilation seemed louder than before. He leaned toward Victoria and whispered something I could not hear. Her expression changed immediately. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier slowly disappeared. She asked for a short recess while the board reviewed additional records. Nearly half an hour later, everyone returned. The attorney stood first. Speaking carefully, he explained that after reviewing the recorded county documents, the association could not verify that my parcel had ever been legally annexed into Willow Creek Ridge. Therefore, the outstanding assessments, fines, compliance notices, and enforcement actions directed toward my property would be withdrawn pending formal correction of the association records. He also recommended immediate removal of all signage suggesting association authority over the riverfront parcel. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. The only sound came from papers being quietly gathered into folders as reality settled across the room. Weeks of threatening letters, invoices, newsletters, and official notices had all collapsed under the weight of a few certified county records that had been publicly available the entire time. As I closed my binder, I realized the river outside had never changed course. Only the story surrounding it had. The following Monday, I woke before sunrise out of habit, poured a cup of coffee into the same enamel mug I had been using since moving into the cabin, and stepped onto the porch. The cool morning air carried the familiar scent of wet cedar, fresh grass, and the river drifting steadily past the old dock. For the first time in weeks, There was no certified envelope waiting in my mailbox. No warning notice sat in my email inbox. No newly installed sign stood near the trail pretending to rewrite the history of this land. Two county maintenance workers arrived just after 8 o'clock with a pickup truck and quietly removed the reflective homeowners association marker that had confused so many visitors. It took them less than 15 minutes to loosen the bolts, lift the post, and drive away. Watching that empty patch of ground felt strangely satisfying because nothing dramatic had happened. The land had not changed. Only the false claim attached to it had disappeared. A week later, I received a formal letter from the homeowners association. Unlike every previous document, this one was surprisingly brief. It confirmed that all assessments, compliance notices, administrative charges, and enforcement actions connected to my parcel had been withdrawn. Their property records had been corrected to reflect the county filings, and future correspondence regarding homeowners association governance would no longer include my address. There was no admission of wrongdoing, but there was something even more important. There was recognition of the public record. I placed the letter inside the same binder that had slowly grown across my dining table over the previous month. Instead of feeling angry, I felt grateful that I had never thrown away a single piece of paper. Every map, every survey, every email, every invoice, and every carefully dated photograph had become another thread leading back to the truth. Several neighbors stopped by over the following weeks while walking the river trail. Some apologized for assuming the homeowners association controlled the shoreline. Others admitted they had believed the official signs without ever questioning them. I did not blame any of them. Most people trust documents that look official. I probably would have done the same if I had not owned the land myself. Frank, the cashier at the general store, smiled when he saw me buying paint one Saturday morning. "Looks like you kept your paperwork after all," he said with a grin. I laughed because he had known from the beginning that records outlast opinions. Before leaving, he handed me a small brass key someone had found inside an old tackle box that once belonged to Harold Benson. It fit the weathered storage cabinet at the end of my dock. Inside rested several faded photographs showing Harold, his father, and his grandfather standing beside the same river decades apart. Behind every photograph, the shoreline looked exactly the same. The boundaries had never moved. Only people had tried to redraw them. Sometimes I still sit on that dock at sunrise with a fishing rod resting across my knees, listening to water slide past the wooden pilings while the first light reaches the opposite bank. Every now and then I think about how easily I could have paid the bill simply to avoid the trouble. It would have been faster. It would have been quieter. But it also would have rewarded a claim that never belonged on paper in the first place. My father used to tell me that rivers never argue about where they flow because they already know their course. Property records are much the same. They do not care about confidence, polished speeches, or official-sounding letters. They simply preserve the truth until someone is patient enough to read them. Justice is not loud. It is smart, patient, and inevitable.